Voice for the Voiceless captures the extraordinary life journey of His Holiness the Dalai Lama. In this book, His Holiness tells the world the pain and struggle of losing his home and people to the Chinese communist invaders, building a life in exile, and envisioning a path forward. Today, we are honored to have Tibetan writer and activist Tenzin Tsundue and Professor Swati Chawla, an Associate Professor of History at the Jindal School of Liberal Arts and Humanities, O.P Jindal University, in this episode of In Conversation with Tibet TV, where we will be hosting a brief discussion on the book today. Welcome to our program, Professor Swati and Tsundue.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
So let me start by asking to both of you, did you find Voice for the Voiceless different from other books that His Holiness has written? If so, how? Should we start with Tsundue first?
Yeah. Thank you for having me here this morning. This book, Voice for the Voiceless, unlike other books by His Holiness the Dalai Lama, Beyond Religion or Freedom in Exile, this is a very personal, there is a deep personal voice in it. So as much as His Holiness tells his story, his efforts in bringing a solution to the cause of Tibet, it also becomes a history of Tibet, in a way, the most recent history of Tibet. And there are many anecdotes that tell beautiful incidences how he dealt with the issue of Tibet. In a very innocent manner, he wrote those anecdotes. And some of them are really endearing to see how a head of a state of a country that lost the independence of Tibet is continuing to maintain its sense of dignity in the worst period of humiliation, disappointment in dialoguing with China, and also letdowns in many of the international arena. And yet he always kept this very unique force in himself, which I felt was the main key message from this book about the humanity. He said, your humanity and the humanity you grant in your adversary, and in this case, China, this spirit is the source of hope for him.
What about you, Professor?
Another thing that stayed with me was when His Holiness says that the moment we came into exile, this is 31st March 1959, he says, I felt I could breathe freely. And my mother said to me that now you can express yourself freely. And he says that my mother too had been carrying this weight. What can you say? What you can't say? Self-censoring. So that I again found, those of us who, I've grown up in India all my life. This freedom is something we take for granted, that we can think and we can speak, we can express ourselves. So when he mentions this, I think that really gives us pause as Indians that, these are, freedoms that are hard won and should be valued.
His Holiness has always referred to himself as the son of India, right? In the book too, he has noted that his mind has been nourished by India's rich philosophical tradition, while his body has been fed by Indian rice and dal, right? Right. So, Professor Swati, in what ways do you think His Holiness has profoundly contributed to the enrichment of India and the Indians?
What has India gained? Immensely, actually. So he mentions, for example, at various points, even on his first visit before he comes into exile, as he is traveling through India, this is the 2500th anniversary, the Buddha Jayanti celebrations that he comes for. As he's traveling through India, he says people flock to the railway stations and they are chanting Dalai Lama Zindabad, Dalai Lama ki jai. So there is this reverence. The first telegram that Jawaharlal Nehru sends to him, that's mentioned in the book, he says that the people of India hold you in veneration, that they think of you already as somebody, who has a relationship with them. And of course, there is a relationship. Even before exile, we would remember that the 13th Dalai Lama had also lived in exile in British India for about 2 years, 1910 to 12. But also in all these decades of exile, the work that the Tibetan community in exile has done on the ground, the TCV schools, for example, so many Indians also study in TCV schools. they go to nunneries and monasteries established under the government in exile. So what, the love and the reverence and the gratitude that people have for both His Holiness's prolonged presence in India, that has again, led to a rejuvenation of India's Buddhist heritage. In my scholarly work, I talk about how Tibetans in exile have been instrumental in starting, in running, administering departments of Tibetan and Himalayan studies across India. So, for example, in this book, he mentions that on his way back to Tibet, the first time he came to India, he stops in Sikkim and lays the foundation stone for the Namgyal Institute of Tibetology. And that's just one, there are institutes in Sarnath, the department in Shantiniketan. The Tibetan monastics who followed His Holiness into exile carried precious manuscripts, started like these, that laid the foundations for these collections. They translated important works. They have served as teachers. They have served as administrators. So I think there is really, this is a two-way debt of gratitude is how I put it.
Right. So Tsundue, do you have anything to add on that?
I think one of the important things that His Holiness contributed in the Buddhist practices in the Himalayas and also all over India was that His Holiness was saying that the Buddhist practice must not be based on blind faith and ritualism, that it should be based on study, continuous study, analysis, questioning, and adopting that only after reasoning and studying. That, going beyond faith and embracing the faith only after study. This is the most important force with which His Holiness tried to, bring about Buddhist practices in the Himalayas, all over India, and then of course to the countries around the world.
So we now spoke about His Holiness's contribution to the enrichment of India, be it how His Holiness has helped in the resurgence of Tibetan Buddhism, and how he's been able to set up several Tibetan schools in exile. So now let's talk about the 5 best practices that His Holiness has mentioned that has immensely helped him overcome challenging times, right? Be it looking at wider perspective or keeping optimism in the face of tragedy, right? So these were, I think, in a way, advice to readers, to us, on how we can look at challenges, right, in life. What do you think on that, Tsundue?
Here, His Holiness, the Dalai Lama, tells you 5 points with which you can deal with your problems. And it's like how the Buddha came about with the 4 Noble Truths. This is the Dalai Lama's 5 Noble Truths. And this is something so very practical. And, firstly, number 1, His Holiness says that we need, as human beings living in this universe, we need to accept that by nature of the world, there are problems. This, of course, looks like something that is based on the first noble truth, that the world is a place of suffering. But what matters here when His Holiness says is that this is the reality, do not escape, do not run away, but accept this as a reality. Now, in the second point, His Holiness says that in order to deal with the problem, look at a wider picture, step back, or look at the causes, origination, and what are the other factors. Number 3, His Holiness says that in any kind of problem, when you deal with it, you need optimism. And optimism gives you hope to deal with any kind of problem, and therefore coming out of that. And then His Holiness says that just as he deals with the issue of Tibet, he goes back into the history. He says that recognize history, and look at it, analyze it, and then move forward. And the last point, I think this is the real takeaway for me personally from this book, is to truly recognize humanity. His Holiness says that as long as you keep that humanity in you, that I have a capacity to come out with a solution. And if you have humanity, if you're granting that humanity, if you think that you have a capacity for kindness, forgiveness, and understanding, and sensitivity to others, His Holiness says that by logic, as a human being, you must also grant that to your enemy, to the other one. You can call the other one enemy or adversary, or the oppressor. And beautifully, His Holiness says that it is your enemy who has a capacity to train you, teach you. So therefore, your enemy is your teacher. And so these 5 points, His Holiness the Dalai Lama gives us a solution for any kind of problem in the world.
Just to add to what Sundula said, the point, His Holiness talks about our shared humanity many places in the book. But here, I just want to read out 1 or 2 lines, if I may. So he says that I once told my fellow Tibetans when marking the first anniversary of the uprising of 1959, that in spite of the fact that we have to oppose Communist China's actions, I can never bring myself to hate its people. And this is a point he makes over and over again, that the Chinese people are actually our brothers in this struggle for freedom, that we want freedom, not just in this narrow sense for Tibetans or Tibetans in exile who live in the free world, but we want it for everybody. That vision doesn't exclude anyone. And he also says that I have a deep appreciation for the ancient nation of China in preserving the Buddhist tradition. And one very specific thing he mentions is that how it is in the Chinese tradition that the Bhikshuni lineage has survived, the female ordination lineage. So he mentions this on page 97.
Also the fact that these points were discussed in such details, in such simple words, and in a very humanly way for us readers by His Holiness, whom a lot of us view as someone beyond this human realm, right? So moving forward to Sino-Tibet conflict, Tsundue, His Holiness has in detail mentioned the 3 stages of dialogue or communication with the Chinese government, right? So it's the period, firstly, it's the period between 1950 to 59, and then roughly we have 78 to 87, and then from 2002 to 2010, right? But could you elaborate a bit on that and tell me, despite such consistent and genuine effort from His Holiness's side, why is the China still not coming to a point where there's mutual agreement and benefit on both sides?
Well, I think in this 70 years of His Holiness the Dalai Lama's efforts in finding a peaceful solution for Tibet, we have seen 3 major stages of efforts of dialoguing with China. Initially, it started from 1950. At the time when we lost the Chamdo battle in 1950, and starting with a negotiation where the Mao Zedong government asked a delegation from Tibet to go, which then went on to 1951, 23rd of May, where the 17-point agreement was signed. This was a shock to His Holiness, that as there was a discussion going on, then His Holiness the Dalai Lama writes in the book that he didn't know that there was such a signature being done, such an agreement was forced upon the Tibetan delegation, 5-member Tibetan delegation led by Ngabyo Ngawa Jigme, which then unilaterally takes away the right of the Tibetan people's independence of Tibet and enforces on Tibet a false sense of autonomy, where they say that they give due respect to the position held by His Holiness the Dalai Lama and also the Panchen Lama, and also says that they respect Tibetan language and culture and religion. But we have seen very fast way in which the entire system collapsed till 1959, which also included His Holiness the Dalai Lama going to Beijing, meeting with Mao Zedong, and that also included His Holiness the Panchen Lama and almost about 100 delegates with His Holiness staying in China for almost about a year. and with an absolute agreement by Mao Zedong that Tibetan language, culture, autonomy will be respected. But all of that, was trampled upon by Chinese effort, and finally leading to Tibetan people rising up on 10th of March 1959 and leading to His Holiness the Dalai Lama having to escape Tibet. So this period of 9 years of talking, discussing, negotiation, this was, I think, one of the most important efforts in all the dialoguing process. And His Holiness says that personally, in a very personal voice, that this was the most difficult period in his life. So this was the first stage. And second started from 1979, where His Holiness's elder brother Gyaltsab Tsundue met with Deng Xiaoping. By then, Mao was gone, Deng Xiaoping maintaining new authority. So that brought in some period of liberalization, which also brought in 4 delegates from exile, representing His Holiness the Dalai Lama and the exile government going to Tibet, the 4 fact-finding delegations, and which also resulted in some of the Tibetans being able to come to India, receive Buddhist teachings from here, and some Tibetans able to go to Tibet and see their relatives. This liberalization, though did not last long, from 79 right up to 86, 87, that was the time when His Holiness the Dalai Lama proposed what is called the 5-point peace plan, and which was completely criticized by China in a way that brought in a new response by Tibetans in the form of the September 27, 1987 protests in Lhasa. So that was the end of the second stage of the dialoguing process. And the third stage was from 2002 when Professor Swati Chawla was leading the exile administration, and which went on to 2010. There, although there were a lot of to and fro, it had very little substance in it. Mostly they were discussing ways and means in discussion, and also they dealt with the lowest rank Chinese officers. And finally, when it came to 2008 Beijing Olympics, by then they, that very year when the delegation went there, they were almost kind of scolded for having Tibetan protests that happened in Tibet and also in exile. And that was the year when the proposal for genuine autonomy through middle way approach was given and was rejected. So throughout all this effort, His Holiness the Dalai Lama says that he had done everything possible from his side to assuage the Chinese side, to have a discussion, to kind of have an understanding, to a point that in 2001, when the Americans were adopting most favored nation status to China, there His Holiness the Dalai Lama supported that. And in 2008, when there was a Beijing 2008 Olympics, again His Holiness the Dalai Lama supported that. When there was a protest going on in Tibet, when the Chinese were trampling upon the Tibetans, and many Western voices, especially heads of the state, they were criticizing China for human rights violations and firing at the Tibetan protests, mostly monks and nuns. Even at that time, His Holiness the Dalai Lama said that the Chinese people deserve a good Olympics. So besides all these efforts, it is frustrating, even from my own side, when I read it, that there were at least about 7 points where His Holiness the Dalai Lama mentioned the word disappointment. So this encapsulates in briefly the 3 important stages of dialoguing with China. And today, there is hardly any, because the Xi Jinping government is steadfastly, orthodoxically maintaining one position, that they want only the Dalai Lama. They're true to the legitimacy with which they want to run China, and they are nothing, and they are not concerned about the issue of Tibet as such, which for His Holiness the Dalai Lama is the core issue. So the distance between Beijing and Dharamshala and Lhasa is widest today, and is mainly caused by Chinese leaders staunch CCP-driven ideology. They just want Tibet and not Tibetan people.
Right. So to add on that, I think it is very important, it's paramount for us to first understand, to acknowledge, and then to respect the fact that His Holiness was only 16 when he had to take up the position of as the temporal leader of Tibet, right? And then he was only 19 when he went to China and met with Chairman Mao, who was about 60 years at that age, right? So coming to the issue of his reincarnation, so the question is for both of you. His Holiness has decisively states that his reincarnation will be born in a free world, right? This is one of the important personal as well as a strong political statement mentioned by His Holiness in the book, right? So in today's time where there is China's growing claim over the recognition and reincarnation of Tibetan Buddhist figures, not just His Holiness, how does this statement serve as a debunk over China's false narrative?
Now to the question of, being reborn in the free world, he gives a rationale for it. He says that for the institution of the Dalai Lama to be able to serve the purpose for which this institution exists, he needs to be, the next Dalai Lama needs to be in the free world. So he says that the traditional mission of the Dalai Lama, that is to be the voice for universal compassion, the spiritual leader of Tibetan Buddhism, and the symbol of Tibet, embodying the aspirations of the Tibetan people. That's the purpose of the institution. And unfortunately, that purpose cannot be fulfilled right now from within Tibet. So you cannot embody the voice of the Tibetan people. You cannot practice Tibetan Buddhism freely. You cannot, even there are restrictions on language. He mentions the boarding schools to which Tibetan children are sent. So I think sometimes there is a danger in reducing a very complex, historically nuanced and evolved position to a soundbite saying the Dalai Lama said he will not be reborn in Tibet. I think he is prefacing this, he's really explaining. It comes towards the end of the book. So if you follow, not just the logic of the book, but his own political trajectory, I think it's important to understand what has led to this position and why he is saying that if there is to be a 15th, that person should be born, in the free world, in a free country.
Sundula.
So this open declaration, up until now, whatever media attention this book has drawn, mainly they all carried this very line, that the next reincarnation of the Dalai Lama will be born in the free world. I think it is also an open declaration to China and tell them that this is our story, not yours. And just because you have physical control over Tibet, you cannot dictate terms on us. And even while His Holiness the Dalai Lama is here in exile, when he is still alive, when he makes this statement, this in a way tells Xi Jinping that we are in control, we are the masters of our own voice. And there is one footnote that I wanted to bring attention to, and that footnote is about what is called the churning of the golden urn. His Holiness the Dalai Lama says in the book that there had been traditionally a role played between His Holiness the Dalai Lama and the Panchen Lama, and they gave recognition to each other in recognizing the new reincarnation. And the footnote said that it was Emperor Qianlong, who was a Manchu king, not Chinese king, Manchu king, who was ruling over China. And he was a Buddhist, and that too practicing Tibetan Buddhist. So he came out with this idea, and it was used in recognizing 2 reincarnations of the Panchen Lama and 3 reincarnations of the Dalai Lama. But it was a ceremonial practice. The most important practice in recognizing the reincarnations were about divination and also invoking the guidance of the oracles and entire process of traditional Tibetan Buddhist based rituals that His Holiness the Dalai Lama says has been the practice. So China cannot take everything out of context and choose only the what is called the churning of the golden urn, and therefore then say, being an atheist, communist, and that too a dictator today, that they can make use of the golden urn to select the next the Dalai Lama. So therefore, with this footnote, the history of the relationship between the Panchen Lama and the Dalai Lama, His Holiness debunks and takes away from China any possibility of China doing anything funny on the next reincarnation of His Holiness.
So for my last question, I'd like to ask both of you, what is your biggest takeaway from the book? And also, if you have to pick one, what message from the book is particularly, would you say, is particularly relevant in today's time? Can we start with you, Professor Swati?
I think to me, the message is that he underlines, sorry, I'm going to cheat and say two messages. One is something Sundula already mentioned, and so did I, that don't hate your oppressor and believe in your, so it's an interconnected message, don't hate your oppressor and believe in shared humanity. So I think the book ends with, and this is again, you know, if you see this book as, if it follows the same trajectory as his own life. So he has always said that there is more at stake in the issue of Tibet than just for the Tibetan people. That this is actually, it's an issue for all of humanity. If we read the Strasbourg proposal, we read the 5-point peace plan, the message is that you cannot exploit resources in one part of the world and then assume that that's going to be confined there, that we are all interconnected. So yes, we shouldn't, you know, hate anybody. We shouldn't exclude anyone from our vision of shared humanity. And when we talk about Tibet's natural resources and the connection between Tibetan culture, religion, and its natural resources, we should know that this is not just for the Tibetan people, that it is for all of us. And I think that is something for us in India when he ends the book with an appeal. And among the things that he appeals to the people of India is that his hope is that the people of India will continue to support Tibetans. And I think there he's perhaps worrying, as many of us worry, what will happen after His Holiness to Tibetans who live in exile. So I think that is something that we could remember as Indians, that both what Tibetans have done for India, as we talked about earlier, but also that we have a stake in Tibet's environment and in the preservation of the Tibetan way of life. So that's the takeaway for me.
What the takeaway that I would keep forever in my life here, though it's difficult for me personally to practice, is about the humanity thing. And I mentioned this earlier. As someone who is an activist, I've been in the Tibetan activism for now about 30 years. I'm now 51. In my entire years of activism, I've been to jail, I've been beaten, I've been stripped naked, I went to Tibet, I was in Lhasa jail, and also many jails in India. So I'm personally and emotionally very deeply involved in it. So I always see I cannot say even adversary. For me, China is enemy. And I don't have a separate word for it because I'm very deeply involved in it. So I've heard great words about compassion and love, but it's very difficult to practice. And I'm honestly and sincerely saying it. But it's a very good idea to call your enemy your adversary, and to grant humanity in China. And those of us who have directly physically suffered under Chinese occupation, it is too difficult to step back and say they are also human beings. But looking at the dictatorial regime Xi Jinping is running today, merciless capitalist country where there is no respect for humanity, not even their own people and their country. The Chinese people are suffering with no democracy and no freedom. and yet the Chinese government is dictatorially, running that kind of a regime there. In such a situation, how do you grant humanity in such a authoritarian regime, which is now having the ambition to rule the world, to replace the United States and the Western order of democracy and human rights? So it's such a challenging time, and yet His Holiness says that as you grant humanity in yourself, grant the same humanity in your adversary, because the other one is also human being. And in extension, His Holiness says that the entire universe of 7 billion human beings are all same. We must not have discrimination. So these are great ideas, but very difficult to practice. And that makes His Holiness the Dalai Lama, His Holiness the Dalai Lama. And ordinary people like us, we can only appreciate and love him and worship him, but very difficult to practice. So therefore, this book, Voice for the Voiceless, His Holiness the Dalai Lama has become the voice of the Tibetan people. But in the chapter Appeal, where His Holiness talks about situation in India, in Tibet, in China, and around the world, where number of people, other people, are also oppressed, their voices taken away, their hopes taken away. His Holiness says that do not wait for others. You are your own hope, and you must take the courage. Your hope will give you courage to stand up against dangers, against injustice. So therefore, His Holiness says that be the voice of the voiceless. There are a number of other people, human beings, who cannot even have an imagination of hope. This is where one must rise to the occasion. So again, the title, Voice for Voiceless, is not just His Holiness, but every human being in the world can be a voice for the voiceless.
Right. So Tsundue, you spoke about humanity, right? So that reminds me of one instance in the book where His Holiness mentions about, I'm sorry, I'm forgetting his name, but about a monk in one of His Holiness's close circle, right? When he was imprisoned in China for several years in jail, right? He says there were two moments where I thought it was very dangerous for me, not because he was scared for his life, but he thought he was losing humanity for the Chinese, right? So I think that's a beautiful example, right?
For the prison guards.
Yes.
Yeah.
Right. So with these beautiful takeaways, yet very crucial takeaways, we've come to the end of discussion. Thank you so much, Tsundue and Professor Swati, for being here virtually and in person. For the viewers, thank you for joining us on this discussion today. And that was today's episode featuring Professor Swati Chawla, whose current research project focuses on documenting intellectual and institutional legacies of the Dalai Lama and the broader exile community, and Tenzin Tsundue, well-known Tibetan poet, writer, and activist. See you in the next episode of In Conversation with Tibet TV.
It to be difficult.